15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It all started when Julian Sorrentino, a well-known mafia boss in New York, was sitting in his lavish office, going through stacks of paperwork. The city outside his skyscraper office window was alive, buzzing with the usual noises of the metropolis, but for Julian, it was just background noise to his daily grind. He was used to the quiet after his rise to power, the quiet that came with control. He had everything a man could desire: money, power, and influence. He had carefully built his empire over the years, leaving no room for mistakes. But little did he know, this evening, his life was about to take a drastic turn. As he reviewed another deal, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the caller ID showed it was from a private line. With a sigh, Julian picked up the phone, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Hello, Mr. Sorrentino. I hope I'm not disturbing you. A soft, calm voice said on the other end. Julian's eyebrows furrowed. Who is this? He asked, his voice steady, but a little curious. The voice on the other end hesitated before replying. It's about the child. Julian's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly masked his surprise with his usual cool demeanor. What child? He asked, leaning back in his chair, suddenly intrigued. The voice hesitated again, almost as if it were trying to find the right words. The child the one you fathered with Angela. Julian's mind went blank. Angela, his ex-wife. It had been over a year since their bitter divorce. The memories of their turbulent relationship were still fresh in his mind. He hadn't seen or heard from her in months. How could she? Julian took a deep breath. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't have time for this, he said, starting to hang up. But the voice quickly stopped him. Sir, I'm afraid it's not a game. We've just found out that you were named as the father. The child is 12 months old now, and, well, you need to know. The words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on Julian's chest. A child, 12 months old. He had no idea. It took him a moment to collect his thoughts. I want answers, and I want them now, Julian said firmly, his voice now carrying the authority he was known for. The voice on the other end of the line was quick to respond. I understand, sir. We'll arrange a meeting. The mother will be there. Julian hung up the phone, his mind racing. A child. His child. He hadn't been told, hadn't been given the chance to know. As the reality of the situation sank in, he felt a strange pull, a curiosity he couldn't shake. But he knew one thing for certain. He would find out the truth. And he would do whatever it took to protect what was his. Julian Sorrentino wasn't a man who took things lying down. He never had been. And this child, whether he liked it or not, was now a part of his world. And no one messed with what belonged to him. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the next part of our story. After Julian Sorrentino received that shocking call, everything he knew about his life was turned upside down. He had always considered himself in control, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But now, he was faced with a situation that not only shocked him, but also left him reeling. A child. His child. He had to know more. Julian stood by the window in his luxurious penthouse, looking down at the city below. His mind raced as the weight of the news sank in. 12 months. It had been 12 months since his life with Angela had ended, since their messy divorce, and now, a child had been brought into the equation. A child that he had never known about. A child he had never even been given the chance to acknowledge. His pulse quickened as the thought of having a child, his child, began to take root. He paced back and forth, the sound of his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He wasn't the type to be caught off guard, especially not by something so personal. But the idea of fatherhood, of being tied to a child in a way that couldn't be undone, was something Julian had never considered. He had spent years building his empire, forging connections, and eliminating threats. He had never imagined himself as a father. But this child, no matter how he felt about it, was now a part of his world. And Julian Sorrentino didn't leave things to chance. He controlled his world with iron-fisted precision. He couldn't allow this new element, this child, to slip through the cracks. The mother, Angela, she was the key, the woman he had loved, and yet, the woman who had betrayed him in ways he hadn't fully understood at the time. He remembered the betrayal, the lies, and the eventual divorce that had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He hadn't wanted her in his life anymore. He had thought she was a part of his past. But now, she was back in his life in the form of this child. Julian ran a hand through his dark hair, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The truth was, he didn't know what to feel. He had spent so many years closing himself off from everything that might make him vulnerable. Family, love, commitment. These were things he had cast aside for power and control. But this child was different. This child had the potential to change everything. And Julian was never one to let something that might change his life slip through his fingers. He had to find out the truth. He had to know if this child was really his. But he also had to know who was behind this phone call. Was it some sort of trap? A scheme to get money from him? Or worse, was it a test of his strength? Julian wasn't afraid of anyone, and certainly not of a child, but he knew that power had to be protected at all costs. The next day, Julian arranged a meeting with the woman, the one who had called him about the child. He was determined to get answers, to make sure this wasn't some sort of game. He didn't trust easily, and this woman's motives were still a mystery to him. He wasn't about to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He arrived at the upscale cafe where the meeting was set to take place, his presence immediately commanding attention. The soft murmur of conversations paused as people recognized him. Julian walked past them, his expression unreadable. As he approached the table, he saw her, Angela. She looked different now, older perhaps, but the same sharp eyes, the same controlled demeanor. She stood up as he approached, her posture tense, but she remained composed. Julian, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years gone by. I wasn't expecting you to come. Julian's gaze locked onto hers, his voice low and steady. You shouldn't have called me. Angela looked away briefly, then met his eyes once more. I didn't have a choice. You have a son, Julian. Whether you like it or not, he's yours. Julian's heart skipped a beat at the words. His son. His mind went blank for a moment, the magnitude of it hitting him all at once. He had a son. And that son was in danger. He could feel it in his gut. There were forces at play here, and he had to protect what was his. And just like that, Julian's world was no longer about power, wealth, or control. It was about a child he would protect with everything he had. The game had changed, and Julian Sorrentino was ready to play. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. After Julian's encounter with Angela, everything he thought he knew about his life was now in question. The stark reality of having a child he never knew about, a child that was now a part of his world, began to settle in. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to push it aside, and return to the life he had meticulously built. But as much as he tried to bury the truth, the thought of his son kept resurfacing, and Julian knew there was no going back. Julian's life had always been controlled by his rules, his strategy, and his power. He had no room for mistakes. No space for the vulnerabilities that came with being a father. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this child, this son, was an integral piece of the puzzle he had never planned for. The question was, could he afford to let this unknown variable alter his carefully crafted world? He sat in his penthouse, his mind in turmoil as the reality of the situation began to set in. Angela's words echoed in his head. You have a son, Julian. Whether you like it or not, he's yours. The words hit him harder than he cared to admit. He had a son a son who had been born in the year following their divorce, a child that had never been part of his plan. It wasn't just about bloodlines or inheritance. It was about power, about control. A child could be a threat, a weakness, or worse, a liability. Julian wasn't about to let anyone use his child against him. He would not allow his enemies to exploit this for their gain. His first move was clear. He needed to meet his son. He had to see this child with his own eyes to understand if the boy was truly his, and to gauge the threat level of the situation. He couldn't risk taking anyone's word for it. He had to be sure. He made arrangements to meet with Angela again. This time, he wasn't going to play the game by her rules. He would take control of the situation. As the meeting approached, Julian's mind worked overdrive, calculating every possible outcome. What if Angela was lying? What if this was just a ploy? For money or to manipulate him? Julian had seen it all before. People using children as pawns in their schemes. He wasn't about to fall for it. The day arrived, and Julian walked into the private office he had rented for this meeting. The room was cold and sterile, designed to keep emotions at bay. He sat at the large, dark wood desk, watching the clock tick away. When the door opened, Julian didn't stand. He simply looked up, his expression neutral, as Angela walked in. She seemed different this time. More vulnerable, perhaps, or maybe just more desperate. Her eyes met his, and there was a flicker of something in them. It was no longer the woman he had once known. She was different now. There was something at stake for her, something she wasn't telling him. "Julian," she began, her voice tight. "You're here. That's a good start." He didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch between them, letting her feel the weight of his presence. Finally, he spoke. "Where is he?" Angela took a deep breath, then nodded to the door. A man stepped in, holding a small child in his arms. Julian's gaze immediately locked onto the boy. He was about 3 years old, with dark hair and eyes that mirrored Julian's own. For a moment, Julian didn't know how to react. The child had his eyes. It was impossible to deny the connection. This boy, this child was his. The realization hit Julian harder than he had expected. He had a son. "His name is Luca," Angela said softly. "He's yours, Julian." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a brief moment, time stood still. Julian's mind raced. Everything he had known was changing in front of him. He had a son, and for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years, a crack in his armor, a weakness. Luca's small hands reached out toward him, a silent plea for attention. Julian stood, slowly, as if the weight of the moment had finally settled on his shoulders. He looked at Angela, then back at the child. He was not sure what to do, not sure how to feel, but he knew one thing. This was his son, and no one would take him away. "We'll take care of him," Julian said, his voice calm, but with an edge of determination. "I'm not letting anyone use him against me. Not now, not ever." Angela nodded, relief flooding her face. She had known Julian would be difficult, but she had also known that his power would ensure Luca's safety. Julian bent down, looking into his son's eyes. The child stared back, unblinking. For a moment, Julian wasn't sure what he was feeling. Was it love, protectiveness, or simply the overwhelming sense that he was responsible for this small life now? Whatever it was something he couldn't ignore. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. "Sir, you were named as the father." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue the story. After that life-changing moment in the cafe, Julian Sorrentino felt a shift inside himself. The child, Luca, was undeniably his. The tiny fingers reaching out to him, the familiar gaze of those dark eyes, made him realize that there was no turning back. As he stood there, gazing at his son, something within him stirred. This was no longer just about power, control, or empire. This was about family. Julian had never been one for emotional attachments. His world had always been one of business, power, and ruthless decision-making. Family had never been his priority. He had learned long ago to keep people at arm's length, especially those who could potentially make him vulnerable. And yet, as he looked at Luca, a bond began to form, something that he had never experienced before. It was strange, unfamiliar, but it was undeniable. The child was his responsibility now. The next few days passed in a blur. Julian's mind was constantly on Luca, and the weight of what had just happened settled on his shoulders. He needed to understand how to balance this new responsibility with everything else in his life. He had built an empire, one that was built on control and influence. Could he truly maintain that power with a child now in the picture? The Mafia world was dangerous, filled with enemies who would take any advantage they could. A child could be used against him, a potential liability. And that was something Julian couldn't afford. As he sat in his office, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His trusted lieutenant, Marco, stepped inside. "Boss, we've got a situation," Marco said, his voice low and serious. Julian turned his gaze to him. "What is it?" "It's about the Petrov family. They've been moving in on our territory, and we've received word that they're planning something big. We need to make sure they don't get any ideas," Marco explained. Julian's jaw clenched. The Petrov family was one of his biggest rivals, and their moves were always calculated and dangerous. He had no intention of letting them take control of anything that belonged to him. "I'll handle it," Julian said coldly, his mind already shifting back to business. But as Marco began to discuss the details, Julian's thoughts kept drifting back to Luca. He had just found out he had a son, and now he had to protect him. But that meant handling business, and business meant risks. A few days later, Julian arranged for a meeting with the Petrov family. He knew he couldn't allow them to think they could take advantage of the situation. As much as he didn't want to mix his personal life with business, he had to be realistic. His enemies wouldn't care about his new son. They would only see an opportunity to weaken him. The meeting took place in a discreet, secure location. Julian walked in, his expression as cold as ever. The head of the Petrov family, Viktor Petrov, stood across from him, his cold eyes sizing Julian up. "Sorrentino," Petrov said, his voice thick with an Eastern European accent. "I trust you understand why we are here." Julian nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I understand. But let me make this clear, Petrov. This territory is mine. You'll keep your hands off it, or there will be consequences." Petrov chuckled darkly. "You are a powerful man, Sorrentino. But no one is untouchable. Not even you." The tension in the room was palpable. Julian knew that this was a dangerous game they were playing, but he wasn't about to back down. He had already lost too much in his life, and he wasn't going to let Petrov take anything else. "I don't care who you think you are. This ends here," Julian said, his voice steady and firm. The two men locked eyes, neither willing to give an inch. The meeting ended without resolution, but Julian knew it was far from over. He left the building with a sense of urgency in his step. As he walked out into the night, the weight of the situation became clearer. He couldn't protect Luca if his enemies were allowed to grow stronger. He had to eliminate the threat, and he had to do it quickly. Back at his penthouse, Julian found himself staring out the window once more. He thought about Luca, about the promise he had made to protect him. But the reality of his world, the dangerous world of mafia politics, didn't allow for simple promises. He couldn't afford weakness, not when lives were on the line. But as he looked at the child's photograph on his desk, a part of him felt a deep sense of responsibility, one that he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his son. And for the first time, Julian Sorrentino realized that he might have to sacrifice everything to keep that promise. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. "Sir, you were named as the father." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. After Julian's tense encounter with Viktor Petrov, he realized that the balance of power he had worked so hard to maintain was more fragile than he thought. The threat was not just from his enemies, but from the shifting dynamics in his own life. The child, Luca, was becoming the most important thing in his world, a responsibility that he had never planned for. His empire, once the center of his universe, now felt secondary to this new, uncharted territory of fatherhood. Julian knew that to truly protect his son, he had to remove the threat that loomed over him. His first move was clear. He had to strike first, eliminate the Petrov threat before it became too big to control. He had dealt with rivals before, but this was different. It wasn't just about protecting his business or his reputation. It was about Luca's future. He had to secure his son's safety, and that meant making sure Petrov understood who was in charge. Over the next few days, Julian's mind remained focused on the task at hand. He couldn't afford any distractions. He spent hours in meetings with his most trusted allies, planning his next move with meticulous precision. Every step had to be calculated. Every move had to be perfect. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. But despite the tension, a small part of Julian's mind kept drifting back to Luca. He hadn't spent much time with the child yet, but the moments they shared weighed heavily on him. Julian had never been a man of soft emotions, but there was something about Luca's innocent gaze that stirred something deep inside him. He hadn't allowed himself to feel this vulnerable in years. But as much as he tried to ignore it, he couldn't deny the connection. As Julian prepared to take action against Petrov, he decided it was time to visit Luca again. He needed to see the boy, to remind himself why he was doing all of this. He left his office early one evening, heading to the private estate where Luca was staying. The mansion, hidden behind tall gates and high walls, was a far cry from the cold, sterile world of business Julian was used to. As he arrived, he was greeted by one of his bodyguards, who led him inside. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, as if it had been waiting for Julian's arrival. The child was in the living room, playing with his toys, unaware of the world outside. Julian stood at the entrance, watching his son for a moment. Luca's small hands moved carefully, his concentration focused entirely on the toy in front of him. Julian had always been the one who controlled everything: his business, his associates, his future. But standing there, watching Luca, he realized that he had no control over this. Fatherhood was a different kind of power, one he wasn't prepared for. "Luca," Julian said softly, his voice carrying across the room. The child looked up, his eyes lighting up when he saw his father. For a moment, Julian's heart skipped a beat. The boy's smile was pure, untainted by the complexities of the world around him. "Dad," Luca said, his voice small but filled with innocence. Julian walked over and knelt beside him. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low but filled with an unexpected tenderness. He reached out, placing a hand on Luca's shoulder. "I'm going to make sure nothing happens to you. I'll always protect you, no matter what." Luca smiled again, his tiny hand reaching up to grasp Julian's. In that moment, Julian felt a surge of protectiveness he had never known. This was his son, and he would do anything to keep him safe. But as he looked into the boy's eyes, Julian knew that the road ahead would be filled with danger. He had made enemies, powerful ones, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about family, and Julian was determined to do whatever it took to keep his family intact. As he left the mansion that evening, his mind was clearer than it had been in days. The decision was made. He would strike back at Petrov, hard and fast. He would eliminate the threat before it had a chance to grow. But this time, it wasn't just about the power he wielded. It was about protecting his son, ensuring that Luca would never have to face the dangers of Julian's world alone. And as Julian Sorrentino prepared for the next battle, he understood one thing: nothing in his life would ever be the same. Family had changed everything, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. "Sir, you were named as the father." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. After Julian's decision to strike back at Viktor Petrov and eliminate the threat to his son Luca, he knew that things were about to escalate. The power he had wielded for years, the ruthless control that had built his empire, was now being tested in a way he never expected. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. Protecting Luca meant protecting everything Julian had fought for. As Julian prepared for his next move, he spent hours in his office, mapping out the steps he needed to take. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Petrov was a dangerous man, but Julian had something Petrov didn't: He had resources, connections, and a network of loyal people who would do anything for him. But even with all of that, Julian knew the game was shifting. Petrov's men had been moving in, and Julian's enemies were growing bolder. It wasn't just about the territory anymore. It was about survival. Julian had learned long ago that in his world, if you showed weakness, you would be crushed. And he couldn't afford to let anyone think he was weak. Not now, not when Luca's safety was on the line. As he stared at the map on his desk, Julian thought about Luca again. He hadn't seen the boy in the last few days, but the image of Luca's innocent smile, his small hand reaching out for Julian's, kept coming back to him. Julian had always been focused on power, on control. But now, something had changed. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his son. It was a new kind of motivation, one that made him more dangerous than ever. The decision was made. Julian would confront Petrov directly. He wasn't going to wait for the man to make the first move. He was going to take the fight to him. And this time, there would be no second chances. The next morning, Julian made his way to one of his private warehouses, a place that had long served as his strategic headquarters. It was heavily guarded, a fortress in the heart of the city. As he arrived, his most trusted lieutenant, Marco, was waiting for him. "Boss, everything's in place," Marco said, his expression grim. "We've got men positioned at every exit. Petrov won't see it coming." Julian nodded. "Good. I want this to be quick and clean. We're not giving him any time to react." Marco hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "You know he's not going to go down without a fight, right? Petrov's not the kind of man who just lets go of his territory." Julian's eyes narrowed. "I know, but he's underestimated me. He's going to regret that." They both walked into the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty space. Julian's mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. He was ready for whatever Petrov had in store. As they prepared for the confrontation, Julian couldn't help but think back to the day he first learned about Luca. The call had been a shock, but it had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding for years. The idea that family, blood, and responsibility were things he couldn't simply ignore. But now, those thoughts were replaced by the cold determination to protect his son. Luca was his, and no one was going to take him away. As the hours passed, Julian's plan began to unfold. His men moved into position, and the final pieces of the puzzle came together. He had no doubt that Petrov would fight back hard, but Julian was ready. He had planned for every possible outcome. He was going to end this, one way or another. When the time finally came, Julian stood at the entrance of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the area. Marco stood beside him, his hand on his weapon, waiting for the signal. They could hear the sound of cars approaching in the distance. Petrov's men were close. Julian's grip tightened on his gun. This was it. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and Julian stepped forward, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Petrov. The two men locked eyes, each one sizing up the other. "Sorrentino," Petrov said, his voice cold. "I knew you'd come for me." Julian didn't respond right away. He was calculating, measuring the situation. "This ends tonight, Petrov," he said finally, his voice low but filled with authority. Petrov sneered. "You think you can just take everything from me? You're a fool, Sorrentino." Julian's eyes narrowed. "I'm not taking anything from you. I'm taking what's mine." And with that, the fight began. The first shots rang out, and Julian's men moved quickly, taking down Petrov's guards one by one. The sound of gunfire filled the air as the two factions clashed. Julian moved swiftly, his focus razor-sharp as he navigated the chaos. Petrov was trying to escape, but Julian wasn't going to let him. He had to finish this. As he pursued Petrov through the warehouse, Julian's thoughts were clear. There was no going back now. His son's future was on the line, and Julian wasn't about to lose. Finally, after a tense standoff, Julian found himself face to face with Viktor Petrov. The two men stood in silence for a moment, each one waiting for the other to make a move. "You're not going to win this," Petrov said, his voice strained. Julian's response was cold and final. "I already have." With one swift motion, he took Petrov down, ending the conflict once and for all. As Julian stood over Petrov's defeated body, he knew the battle was over, but the war was far from finished. His world had changed, and now, more than ever, he had to protect what mattered most. His son was his future, and Julian Sorrentino would stop at nothing to ensure that future was secure. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. After Julian Sorrentino took down Viktor Petrov, a moment of quiet settled over his empire. The battle was won, but Julian knew that the war was far from over. Petrov was just one piece of the puzzle, and with each victory, the stakes were only getting higher. The Mafia world was never forgiving, and as Julian looked over the aftermath of the confrontation, he realized that the consequences of his actions would ripple out in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. With Petrov gone, Julian now had to deal with the power vacuum left behind. His own men were eager to fill the void, but Julian knew better than to trust anyone blindly. Loyalty in his world was fragile, and trust was something he gave sparingly. He needed to reassert control, make sure that his position as the leader was unchallenged. The thought of his son, Luca, kept him grounded. Julian had always prided himself on being a man of action, but now, with Luca in his life, things had changed. He couldn't afford to let his enemies get close to his son. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The next few days were a blur of meetings and strategizing. Julian spent hours going over every angle, making sure that no stone was left unturned. He wasn't just preparing for the next battle. He was securing his future, ensuring that Luca would grow up in a world where he wouldn't have to fear for his life. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about family. One evening, Julian sat in his office, staring at the city lights below. It was quiet, too quiet. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to press down on him all at once. He thought about the early days of his rise to power, about the sacrifices he had made, the people he had crossed. Everything had been for the pursuit of control. But now, for the first time, he felt something else, a deep, unwavering desire to protect. It was a strange feeling for Julian, one that made him question his past decisions. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone rang. It was Marco. Boss, we've got a situation. Marco's voice was urgent, pulling Julian back into the present. What's going on? Julian asked, already sensing that something was wrong. There's been a break-in at one of the safe houses. We've got some guys in custody, but it looks like Petrov's men were involved, Marco said. Julian's heart skipped a beat. Petrov was dead, but it seemed like his legacy wasn't. Where are they now? Julian asked, standing up from his desk. They're at the warehouse on 5th. We're holding them there, Marco replied. Julian's jaw clenched. This wasn't over. Petrov's death had sent a clear message, but apparently, there were others who were still looking to take a piece of his empire. Julian couldn't allow that. He had worked too hard to get to where he was, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. As Julian arrived at the warehouse, he was greeted by Marco and his team. The place was secured, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Julian walked inside, his eyes scanning the room. A few of his men stood near the door, while others kept a close eye on the captives. The first thing Julian noticed was the look on the faces of the prisoners. They were scared, but there was something else, something that told him they weren't just petty criminals. What do we have here? Julian asked, his voice cold and steady. Marco stepped forward. These men were part of Petrov's crew, but it seems like they've been working with some new players, outside interests, possibly from Italy. Julian's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about territory anymore. There were bigger players involved, and that meant more risk. He moved toward the prisoners, his presence imposing. Who sent you? He asked, his voice hard. The men remained silent, refusing to answer. Julian stepped closer. You can stay silent, but that won't help you. You're either going to talk, or I'm going to make sure you never speak again. One of the men flinched, his fear evident. The other tried to remain calm, but the tension in the room was too much to ignore. I won't ask again, Julian said, his eyes locking onto the man in front of him. Who sent you? After a long pause, the man spoke. We were hired by someone high up. Someone who wants to take you down, Sorrentino. Julian's mind raced. He had always known that his power made him a target, But this was different. This wasn't just about taking down a rival. It was about a coordinated effort to bring him down. Who? Julian demanded, his patience running thin. The man hesitated, but Julian didn't give him the chance to think. Tell me now, or I'll make sure you regret it. The man finally cracked. It's Giovanni Moretti. He's the one behind this. Julian's stomach dropped. Giovanni Moretti. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Moretti was a power player in the European underworld, someone Julian had crossed years ago. He had assumed Moretti was out of the picture, but clearly, he had underestimated him. Giovanni Moretti. Julian muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do now. He had to go after Moretti, eliminate the threat before. It could destroy everything he had worked for. But there was something else, something he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about his empire anymore. This was about his son, Luca. And Julian would stop at nothing to ensure that Luca would never have to face the dangers of his world alone. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. Julian Sorrentino had always prided himself on staying ahead of his enemies. But the revelation of Giovanni Moretti's involvement in the plot against him had shaken him to the core. Giovanni was not just any adversary. He was a formidable figure in the European underworld, a man whose reach extended far beyond what Julian had ever anticipated. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Julian's shoulders. The game had changed. It was no longer just about controlling his empire. It was about protecting his son, Luca, and ensuring that no one could threaten their future. Julian had to act quickly. Moretti was not someone who played fair or waited for the perfect moment to strike. Julian knew that he had to make the first move, and he needed to do it with precision. There could be no room for error. In the days that followed, Julian gathered his most trusted allies. His right-hand man, Marco, had already begun tracking Moretti's movements, but Julian knew that they had to be careful. Moretti was notorious for his ability to stay one step ahead of his enemies, and Julian wasn't willing to take unnecessary risks. As the plans unfolded, Julian's mind kept returning to Luca. The boy had become his anchor, his motivation, and his reason for fighting. For the first time in his life, Julian felt that someone, was more important than his power. The thought of his son growing up in a world where danger lurked at every corner was unbearable to him. Julian had never been one to show weakness, but the vulnerability he felt for Luca was different. It was a sharp, painful reminder of what he stood to lose. One evening, Julian found himself sitting in his office, alone. The city sprawled out below him, the lights twinkling like stars, but he felt a sense of isolation he had never experienced before. He had always believed that power was the answer to everything, that it was the one thing that could protect him from the world's threats. But now, as he thought about Luca, he realized that power alone wouldn't be enough. He had to build a future that was secure, one where his son could grow up without fear. Just as Julian was lost in thought, his phone rang. It was Marco. Boss, we've located Moretti. Marco's voice was sharp, urgent. He's been hiding out in a mansion on Long Island. We have an address. It's time to make our move. Julian's heart raced. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for had arrived. Good, Julian said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. I want everything in place. No mistakes. We take him down tonight. The plan was simple. Julian and his men would move in quickly, neutralize Moretti's guards, and capture him before he had a chance to react. They couldn't afford to give Moretti any time to regroup or retaliate. Julian wasn't just going to take down Moretti, he was going to send a message. As the team gathered and prepared to leave, Julian paused for a moment. He thought about Luca, about the future he wanted to provide for his son. This was the only way to ensure that Luca would be safe, that no one would threaten their family again. The drive to Long Island was tense. Julian's thoughts remained focused on the mission ahead. They couldn't afford distractions. Moretti had to be dealt with, and Julian was determined to finish what he had started. As they arrived at the mansion, Julian's men moved swiftly, taking positions around the property. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and imposing. It was clear that Moretti had been preparing for something, perhaps anticipating an attack, but Julian was ready for him. The quiet night air was pierced by the sound of boots on gravel as Julian and his men approached the mansion's front door. Marco gave a nod, and the door was kicked open. The interior was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that meant danger was lurking just out of sight. Julian led the way, his eyes scanning the shadows. He had been in situations like this before, outnumbered, outgunned, but always in control. They moved through the mansion, clearing each room methodically. Julian's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus remained sharp. The trap was set. They reached the back of the mansion, where Moretti had been hiding. Julian's breath caught in his throat as he saw the man standing in front of him. Giovanni Moretti. The two men locked eyes, and in that moment, the years of animosity, of power struggles, came to a head. "Sorrentino," Moretti said, his voice cold and steady. "I knew you would come for me." Julian didn't flinch. "You've made a mistake, Moretti. This ends now." Moretti smiled, but it was a thin, calculating smile. "You think you've won, but you're just a pawn in a much bigger game." Julian's gaze darkened. "I'm not your pawn, Moretti. You're the one who's about to lose." With that, Julian stepped forward, his hand reaching for the gun at his side. The fight was about to begin, but this time, it wouldn't be just about power. It would be about survival. It would be about protecting Luca. Julian had come too far to let anyone take that away from him. This was the final battle, and Julian was determined to win, no matter the cost. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. "Sir, you were named as the father." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. The tension in the room was palpable as Julian stood face to face with Giovanni Moretti. Every word, every move had led to this moment. The warehouse was silent except for the soft hum of the lights overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. Julian's fingers hovered near his gun, but his eyes never left Moretti's. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. This wasn't just a battle for power, this was personal. "I've been waiting for this moment," Moretti said, his voice calm, almost mocking. "You think you've won, Sorrentino? You're just a piece in a much larger game." Julian's grip on his weapon tightened. "This ends now, Moretti," he said, his voice unwavering. Moretti's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, his cold eyes glinting in the dim light. "You think killing me will end it?" he asked. "It's not that simple. The moment you decided to interfere with my business, you signed your own death warrant." Julian stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "I'm not here to discuss your plans. I'm here to make sure this game ends before it destroys what I have left," he said, his words like ice. Moretti's eyes flickered with something that could have been fear, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You're making a mistake, Julian. You'll regret this," he warned. But Julian wasn't listening. He was done talking. His thoughts were no longer on his empire, or even on Moretti. All he could think about now was his son, Luca. The boy was his responsibility, and Julian wasn't going to let anyone, especially Moretti, threaten his future. The gunfire rang out, sharp and sudden, shattering the silence. Julian moved quickly, his reflexes honed from years of living in a world of constant danger. Moretti's men tried to retaliate, but they were no match for Julian's trained crew. The fight was swift, brutal, and one-sided. Julian moved through the warehouse with a calm, calculated precision, taking down Moretti's guards one by one. It wasn't about proving his strength anymore. It was about securing his son's safety. As Julian reached Moretti, the man was already backing away, a sense of desperation creeping into his expression. Julian's eyes narrowed. "It's over," he said, his voice low. Moretti was cornered, and for the first time, Julian saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. But Moretti wasn't the type to go down without a fight. "You won't be able to protect your son, Sorrentino," Moretti spat. "There are others who want you gone. You can't escape them." Julian didn't flinch. "I don't need to escape anyone. I need to make sure they understand that I'm not someone they want to mess with." With that, Julian took a step closer, his gun now aimed directly at Moretti. You don't get to threaten me or my family ever again. The final shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse. Moretti collapsed to the floor, his life extinguished in an instant. Julian stood over him for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over him. This was the end of Moretti, but not the end of the battle. Julian knew that there were others out there who would try to take his place, who would try to destroy what he had built. But he wasn't afraid. He had his son now, and that meant everything. As the last of Moretti's men were neutralized, Julian's thoughts returned to Luca. He needed to get back to the boy. His mind raced with plans to ensure that no one could ever touch him or Luca again. This wasn't just about surviving in the Mafia world anymore. It was about securing a future, about making sure that his son could live without fear. Julian had always thought that power was the most important thing in his life, but as he left the warehouse, his mind was clear. His son was the future. And no matter what it took, Julian would do whatever it took to protect that future. He knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Julian felt something different, something stronger than fear. It was hope. The kind of hope that came from knowing that he wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for Luca, and nothing would stop him from securing that future. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. Julian's heart pounded as he stepped into the darkened room. The weight of his recent victory against Moretti was still heavy on his shoulders, but something inside him had shifted. He had always been a man of action, calculating every move with precision. But now, with Luca in his life, he realized that some things couldn't be controlled by power alone. As he stood there in the silence, his mind drifted back to the child he had only recently discovered existed. He had never been prepared for fatherhood, never thought he'd have to protect a son. But now, it wasn't just about protecting his empire, it was about Luca. The phone call from Marco snapped him out of his thoughts. Boss, we have another problem, Marco said, his voice tense. Julian's gaze hardened. What now? There's been a breach. Some of Petrov's old men are gathering at the docks. They've been trying to make deals with some other families. It looks like they're planning something big. Julian's jaw clenched. He knew this wasn't over. Moretti was dead, but his influence, his network, still lingered. Get the details, Julian ordered, his voice sharp. I'll deal with this personally. The next few hours were a blur. Julian and his men moved quickly, gathering intelligence and preparing for the confrontation. It wasn't just about taking down a rival anymore. It was about making sure that his son's future was secure, that no one could touch the life he was building. The docks were quiet when Julian arrived. The faint sound of the waves crashing against the pier echoed through the night. His men were already in position, waiting for his signal. The air was thick with tension as Julian made his way toward the warehouse where the meeting was supposed to take place. He had been in situations like this before, but tonight felt different. The weight of his responsibility to Luca pressed heavily on him. This wasn't just another business deal. This was a battle for survival. As Julian approached the warehouse, he could see the figures of his enemies in the distance, gathered in a small group. They were unaware of his presence, but Julian knew that he couldn't afford to make a sound. He signaled to his men, and they moved into position. The plan was simple. Take them out before they had a chance to retaliate. Julian knew the risks. One mistake, and everything could fall apart. But he wasn't about to let that happen. He had come too far, fought too hard. This wasn't just for him anymore. It was for Luca. The confrontation was swift. The men didn't stand a chance against Julian and his team. They had underestimated him, thinking that the death of Moretti would be the end of the story. But Julian was more determined than ever. He had to eliminate the threat before it grew any stronger. As the last of the men were subdued, Julian stood over them, his eyes scanning the scene. He had done what needed to be done, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. This wasn't the end. There were always more enemies, always more challenges. And the thought of Luca, his son, growing up in this dangerous world made Julian's resolve even stronger. Marco, Julian said, turning to his lieutenant. Make sure they don't get back up. We're done here. Marco nodded, his face unreadable. Understood. As Julian walked away, the sound of the waves crashing against the pier seemed to grow louder, almost as if the ocean itself was echoing his thoughts. He had fought for control his whole life. He had built an empire, a legacy. But now, with Luca in the picture, Julian realized that the true battle was not just for power, it was for the future. He was determined to make sure that his son would have a life free from the dangers that had defined Julian's existence. As he made his way back to his car, Julian's mind was clear. He would protect Luca. He would protect his family. And no matter what, no one would stand in his way. The future was his to control, and he would not let anyone take that away from him. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. Julian stood in the cold, dimly lit alleyway outside the warehouse, his thoughts racing after the night's violent confrontation. The feeling of adrenaline still coursed through his veins as he made his way to his car. The battle had been quick, but the aftermath was heavy on his shoulders. Moretti's men had been eliminated, but Julian knew the damage wasn't over. Petrov's empire might have fallen, but there were others, always others, ready to take his place. The Mafia world was never truly at rest. The thought of Luca, his son, lingered in his mind. Julian had been in control of every aspect of his life, his business, his empire, his future, but now, with Luca in the picture, everything had changed. For the first time, Julian realized that he was no longer just fighting for power. He was fighting for his family. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, but he couldn't afford to back down. The phone rang in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Marco. Boss, we've got a problem. Marco's voice was tight with urgency. Julian's eyes narrowed. What is it? It's about the Petrovs. They're regrouping. Word is, they've got more men coming in from Italy. It's getting bigger than we thought, Marco explained. Julian clenched his jaw. He had known the Petrovs wouldn't go down easily. I want a meeting with our contacts. We need to get ahead of this, he said, his voice cold and steady. As he ended the call, Julian's mind raced. The Petrov threat hadn't been fully neutralized, and now Moretti's death was only adding fuel to the fire. He had to act quickly to contain the situation before it escalated. As he arrived at his estate, the familiar sight of the towering gates and lavish grounds did little to ease his tension. His world had grown smaller, and now, more than ever, he had to protect what was his. Julian walked through the grand hallway of his mansion, the weight of the world on his shoulders. His gaze fell on the photograph of Luca, the boy he had only recently found out was his son. The child's smile was innocent, untouched by the darkness of the world Julian lived in. The sight of it stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: vulnerability. For the first time, Julian understood what it meant to truly protect someone. Not for power, not for money, but because they were his. As Julian sat in his office, his mind turned to Luca again. He had been so consumed by his business, his empire, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered. Luca was his legacy, his future, and he couldn't let anyone take that away from him. The phone rang again. This time, it was one of his trusted associates, a man named Dominic. Boss, we have eyes on the Petrovs. They're moving, and they're coming closer, Dominic said, his voice low. They've set up shop in the city. I suggest we act before they make a move. Julian's mind raced. The Petrovs were coming closer, and every second counted. Set up a meeting. I want to know everything they're planning, Julian said, his voice laced with determination. He was done waiting. It was time to take the fight to them. That night, Julian met with his top lieutenants and his trusted allies. The plan was set. They would not wait for the Petrovs to make the first move. Julian was going to strike first, and he would do it with everything he had. He had no more time to waste. As the hours passed, Julian's men moved into position. He watched them, each man knowing their role, their duty to him. They were loyal, and in this world, loyalty was everything. As the final pieces of the puzzle came together, Julian's mind was once again consumed with thoughts of Luca. The boy was safe for now, but Julian knew that the danger wasn't over. As long as the Petrovs were breathing, there would always be a threat. He had to act quickly and decisively. The night was quiet as Julian and his men moved into the heart of the city. They knew the Petrovs were waiting, but Julian wasn't concerned. He had always been one step ahead of his enemies. The silence in the air only heightened the tension. Julian's mind was focused on the task at hand. His son was counting on him. As they reached the Petrovs' compound, Julian's heart rate quickened. The moment had arrived. This would be the turning point. His men were ready. He was ready. This time, there would be no room for mistakes. With a deep breath, Julian led the charge, stepping into the unknown. This was more than just a fight for power. This was a fight for his family, and Julian Sorrentino wasn't going to lose. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. Sir, you were named as the father. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the story. Julian stood outside the Petrovs' compound, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. The time for talking had passed. His men were in position, ready to strike, and Julian's mind was focused on one thing: his son, Luca. He had made it clear to everyone that there was no price too high to pay to protect him. His empire, his wealth, his influence, all of it was secondary now. Julian had never been one to put his emotions on display, but the truth was, Luca had changed everything. The fight that was about to unfold wasn't just for his business or for control of territory. It was about securing the future of the only thing in his life that truly mattered. As the team moved forward, Julian could hear the soft shuffle of his men's footsteps behind him. Every move they made had been meticulously planned. They had learned from the past, from the mistakes of letting their guard down. This time, they would end it decisively. The Petrovs weren't just another rival gang. They had connections everywhere, and their reach extended beyond what Julian had initially realized. But Julian wasn't about to let that stop him. This was his city, and no one would take it from him, not while Luca was depending on him. The first shot was fired without warning. It rang through the night air, sharp and clean, followed by a series of muffled sounds as Julian's men moved in. The Petrovs had been expecting some kind of retaliation, but Julian was swift, his men trained to eliminate any threat before it had a chance to escalate. The element of surprise was his greatest weapon, and he was using it to its fullest advantage. Julian moved through the compound with the ease of someone who had been in countless fights before. He had built this world on his terms, and he wouldn't let anyone, no matter how powerful, destroy it. As he moved deeper into the compound, Julian's focus was razor-sharp. He had no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. Each step brought him closer to securing Luca's future. He wasn't just fighting for his empire. He was fighting for the chance to give his son a life free from the violence that had defined his own. The fighting was brutal, swift. Men fell one by one, and Julian's men made sure there were no survivors. He couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. As he approached the main building where Viktor Petrov was rumored to be hiding, Julian felt a surge of determination. The end was near. This was the moment that would decide everything. He had to finish it. Inside the building, the tension was thick. The guards that remained stood watch, unaware that Julian and his men were closing in. Julian's footsteps echoed in the hall, a constant reminder of the inevitable. Petrov had always been a survivor, a man who never backed down. But Julian knew that this was different. Petrov's time had come. When Julian and his team reached the room where Petrov was hiding, they found him in a dark corner, his expression hard and cold. Sorrentino, Petrov sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. I should have known it would come to this. Julian didn't flinch. You should have stayed out of my way, Petrov, he said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet menace. Petrov laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. You think you've won? You're just a man, Sorrentino. You can't control everything. Julian stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. I don't need to control everything. I just need to protect what's mine. The room was thick with tension as the two men locked eyes. Julian wasn't just here to take down a rival. He was here to ensure that his son's future would be secure, no matter the cost. The gunshot rang out, loud and final, signaling the end of Petrov's reign. As the man crumpled to the floor, Julian stood over him, his mind already shifting back to Luca. This wasn't about the fight. It was about securing the future. The quiet of the room was shattered by the sound of footsteps. Julian's men had completed their mission, and the compound was now under his control. But Julian didn't celebrate. There was no time for that. He had to get back to Luca. He had promised the boy that he would protect him, and Julian intended to keep that promise. As he left the compound, his thoughts were clear. The fight was over, but the war for his family's safety would continue. No one would threaten Luca's future again. Julian had won, but in his mind, there was always more to be done. The real work had only just begun. As the night stretched on, Julian knew that this victory was just the beginning of the next chapter in his life. A chapter that, for the first time, wasn't defined by power or fear. It was defined by the future he would give his son. And nothing at all, would stand in his way. 15 months after divorce, the Mafia boss gets a call. "Sir, you were named as the father." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's continue with the final part of the story. The quiet of the morning seemed to settle on Julian as he arrived home, the events of the past days finally coming to a close. The house, once full of tension and danger, was now eerily peaceful. Yet, Julian knew that peace was fragile in his world. The enemy had been dealt with, but the weight of his actions still pressed heavily on him. He had faced Moretti, defeated the Petrovs, and fought for control over his world. But none of that mattered as much as the small life he had promised to protect. Luca, his son, the one thing in his life that had changed everything. Julian walked through the hallways of his mansion, his mind racing. The cold, calculated Mafia boss who had once feared nothing now found himself haunted by the responsibilities of fatherhood. Protecting his son was not just about eliminating threats, but about shaping a future he never thought he would have. He entered Luca's room, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the boy playing with his toys. The innocence in Luca's eyes, the carefree nature that every child should have, was a sharp contrast to the dark world Julian had fought so hard to survive in. For a brief moment, Julian allowed himself to take in the sight. This was what he had fought for. This was his future. He had built an empire on power, on fear, and on bloodshed, but now he had something else, something more important than all of it. Luca's presence in his life was the anchor that kept him grounded. He moved toward the child, crouching down to his level. Luca looked up, his face lighting up as he saw his father. "Dad!" he exclaimed, rushing into Julian's arms. Julian's heart swelled. It had been a long, difficult journey, but moments like this reminded him of what truly mattered. He smiled, holding Luca close. "How's my boy?" Julian asked softly, his voice filled with affection he never thought he'd be capable of showing. "I'm good, Dad. Look, I built a tower." Luca beamed, showing Julian a stack of blocks. Julian couldn't help but laugh, the sound of it unfamiliar but comforting. It was in that moment, holding his son in his arms, that he realized something deep within himself. This was it. This was the most important thing he would ever do, protecting Luca, giving him a life free of the danger and violence that had plagued Julian's own. He had fought to secure his empire, but now, he was fighting for something bigger. As the days passed, Julian kept a careful watch on his empire, ensuring that no one could come after his family. But he also made time for Luca, playing with him, spending time together, building a life that was different from the one Julian had known. Slowly, the man who had once ruled with an iron fist began to understand that love, loyalty, and protection were the true forces that could shape a future. His mind, once consumed by strategy and revenge, now focused on creating a world where his son could grow up without fear, without the shadows of the Mafia world hanging over him. As Julian and Luca sat together in the garden one afternoon, watching the sunset, Julian felt a sense of peace he had never known. The fight for his future had been long and brutal, but he had emerged victorious. Moretti was gone. The Petrovs had been crushed. The threats were neutralized. And now, the most important thing in his life was sitting beside him, safe, happy, and unaware of the dark world his father had come from. Julian knew that the world he had created for Luca would not be free of danger, but he also knew that he would always be there, standing between his son and the threats of the past. He would never let anyone hurt Luca. He would never let anyone take away the future he was building. In that moment, as he watched his son laugh and play, Julian Sorrentino realized that the real victory was not in power or control, it was in love. The love he had for Luca. The love that would drive him to do anything, to sacrifice everything, to ensure his son's safety. And as the last light of the day faded, Julian knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not just a legacy, but a family. And nothing in the world would ever take that away from him. In this gripping tale of dark romance, Julian Sorrentino, a powerful mafia boss, finds his world turned upside down when he discovers that he has a son, Luca, from a past he thought he left behind. As Julian battles rivals, eliminates threats, and strives to protect his empire, he also faces a more personal fight, one for the safety and future of his son. With every dangerous step he takes in the world of power and betrayal, Julian discovers that true strength comes not only from control, but from the love and protection of those he holds dear. As Julian faces ruthless enemies like Giovanni Moretti and Viktor Petrov, he realizes that his greatest challenge is not securing his empire, but securing the future of his family in this dark romance that transcends the mafia world. Each victory he claims in his battle for power brings him closer to the realization that his son's safety is the only legacy worth fighting for. This dark romance takes readers through a whirlwind of suspense, passion, and danger, showing how love and loyalty can conquer even the darkest of times. Through every violent clash and tense confrontation, Julian fights not only for survival, but for the future of his son in a world that threatens to consume them both. In the end, the ultimate battle Julian faces is not against rivals, but against the darkness within his own world that could tear everything apart. With thrilling action, unforgettable characters, and a powerful journey of redemption, this story of dark romance will leave you on the edge of your seat until the very last page.